Let's face an uncomfortable truth. Folks, despite the combined might and resources of Washington and Tel Aviv, we have not been able to break Iran. If we step back and look at the scoreboard right now, the reality on the ground is stark. Tehran is currently holding the winning hand. We haven't met a single one of our core strategic objectives. Worse yet, we've effectively surrendered control of one of the most vital global choke points, the Strait of Hormuz. Frankly speaking, both the United States and Israel are standing in a far more precarious position today than we were before the first shot was even fired. Think about it. If the sheer force of our two nations working in tandem couldn't get the job done, it's a pipe dream to assume Israel can handle this alone. Yet, the strategy coming out of the Israeli leadership remains unchanged. They want America to stay anchored in this fight. They want us to keep swinging, hoping that a long, grueling war of attrition will eventually bleed Iran dry and cripple their capabilities. But let's think this through like realists. If we decide to climb higher up that escalation ladder, what are our actual options left? Do we send in the bombers again? That's certainly a scenario President Trump has weighed, but here is the tactical dilemma. We are practically out of strictly military targets. To keep a bombing campaign going, we'd be forced to cross a very dangerous line, striking civilian infrastructure. We're talking about taking out power grids and destroying their energy sectors. And make no mistake, Tehran won't just sit back and take it. They have serious teeth, and they will bite back. How? By completely choking off the Red Sea and putting an absolute iron lock on whatever little oil is still flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. We're also looking at the very real threat of Iranian retaliation against Saudi Arabia and our other Gulf allies. The fallout from that, an absolute catastrophe for the global supply chain, sending shockwaves straight into the American economy, hitting Main Street, hitting our wallets, and draining retirement accounts. So, a prolonged air campaign, it's just not on the table. Remember, we've already burned through a massive chunk of our high-tech, precision-guided munitions. Going back on the offensive means depleting our limited stockpile of these expensive, boutique weapons even further, leaving America vulnerable on other global fronts. What about boots on the ground? Forget it. We simply do not have the combat troop levels in the Middle East to mount a serious land invasion. And even if we drafted 1 million men tomorrow, marching a land army into the mountainous fortress of Iran would be a historic, unmitigated disaster. It just wouldn't work. When you strip away the political spin, a military only has 3 main tools: the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. We have zero capability for an Army option. We already tried the Air Force option with initial bombardments, and it failed to bend the regime. That leaves us exactly where we are today, leaning entirely on the Navy to enforce a blockade. But a blockade is just a waiting game, not a victory strategy. It offers zero guarantee of ending this conflict on terms favorable to us. The hard, undeniable truth we need to swallow. We have run out of viable military options. But beyond the battlefield, there's the economic bleeding. For many of us watching this unfold, the financial fallout actually eclipses the military maneuvers. The collateral damage being inflicted on the global market right now is staggering. Because of this, President Trump has a massive, urgent vested interest in slamming the brakes on this conflict. Frankly, he'd prefer to have a deal signed yesterday. The pressure to get everyone to the negotiating table is absolutely enormous. However, the commander-in-chief is running headfirst into a massive roadblock, Tel Aviv. The Israelis simply aren't interested in a ceasefire. This is a crucial dynamic you have to grasp. Folks, Washington is actively looking for an off-ramp, while Israel wants to keep the pedal to the metal. The reality is, Israel cannot pull this off without American backing. If the U.S. decides to pack it up and sign a hard truce, what is Tel Aviv's next move? Go rogue. Strike Tehran solo. And risk national annihilation? Not a chance. That's exactly why they desperately need us tethered to this fight. But the president's primary objective is to pull the plug on this whole ordeal before the economic damage becomes irreversible. He understands that if this drags out, the financial devastation will require an immediate settlement. Yet, he keeps hitting that same wall of Israeli opposition. Then you have voices within our own ranks complicating matters. Take the recent rhetoric from our own diplomats, sounding less like seasoned statesmen and more like campaign politicians. Their go-to playbook is that dangerous, hawkish strategy of escalating to de-escalate. They publicly champion a policy of maximum pressure, threatening to completely sever Iran's economic lifelines with secondary sanctions on anyone touching Iranian oil dollars. They openly argue that leveling civilian infrastructure like bridges and power grids run by the IRGC is entirely fair game, brushing off any accusations of war crimes as ridiculous and fake. The underlying assumption here is a classic hardliner fantasy that if we just turn the screws tight enough and punish them financially and militarily, Tehran will simply wave the white flag and surrender their nuclear ambitions. Just get tougher. They say, but this mentality has two fatal blind spots. First off, Washington and Tel Aviv aren't just geopolitical rivals to the Iranian regime. We represent an existential threat to their very survival. When a nation believes its entire existence is on the line, they don't surrender. They dig in. They will fight to the very last man, defending their soil with the ferocity of cornered wild dogs. There will be no white flags. Secondly, these political hawks fail to realize who actually holds the cards if things move up the escalation ladder. The idea that American jets can just roll in, systematically dismantle Iranian power plants, and expect the Ayatollahs to just sit there, take it on the chin, and give up is absolute nonsense. They will hit back, and they possess the asymmetric capabilities to make life incredibly painful for us. Look around. The global economy is already taking on water. We are essentially on the Titanic, steering straight toward an iceberg. And someone needs to grab the wheel and alter course to shut this down. The president knows this, but if we decide to raise the stakes, Tehran will immediately match our bet. And where does that leave the American taxpayer? Staring down the barrel of an unprecedented economic crisis against an enemy that still refuses to yield. The whole escalate to de-escalate theory is a myth. If we push the button on escalation, we aren't paving the way for peace. We are just buying ourselves a world of unrelenting trouble. Consider that recent incident where our boys, whether it was the Navy or the Marines, boarded an Iranian vessel. They shot up the engine block and essentially commandeered the ship. Now, in that specific case, it was just an empty cargo freighter. But play this scenario out a few steps further. What happens when Washington orders that exact same move on a Chinese supertanker loaded to the brim with 3 or 4 million barrels of crude oil? Beijing isn't going to just sit on their hands. Do they start deploying their own naval destroyers as escorts? Do they start mounting heavy machine guns and surface-to-air missiles, man-pads right on the decks of their merchant fleet, ready to blow our boarding helicopters right out of the sky? The Chinese have a formidable playbook, and they certainly aren't going to let us dictate the terms of global shipping indefinitely. We are staring down the barrel of a massive, uncontrollable escalation. And let's be brutally honest with ourselves. If the Chinese start putting military escorts on their tankers, the U.S. is going to blink. We will back down because nobody in the Pentagon actually wants a hot war with China. But the longer we let this Middle East quagmire drag on, the closer we get to pulling Beijing and Moscow directly into the fray. Make no mistake about it, both Russia and China have a massive strategic interest in seeing Iran come out on top. They are backing Tehran now, and they will continue to back them long after the dust settles. What we are witnessing is the hardening of a dangerous new axis: Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia lined up on one side of the chessboard, with the United States and Israel increasingly isolated on the other. So you have to ask yourself, is anyone in leadership actually admitting that this campaign is failing. If you look past the political theater and the campaign rhetoric, the truth is that almost every serious decision maker in both Washington and Tel Aviv knows the score. Behind closed doors, it is crystal clear to the brass that we have failed to meet our objectives. The real question now is, what's the next move? For the Israeli establishment, the goal hasn't changed. They want Uncle Sam to stay in the trenches. They want us to launch a massive joint bombing campaign and just keep relentlessly hammering Iranian soil. But back home in the States, I'd wager that the majority of the president's inner circle wants to pull the ripcord and shut this war down before it's too late. To them, Israel's demands for endless conflict are becoming a massive strategic liability. But the water in Washington is incredibly muddy. We have deep-rooted factions operating right inside the U.S. government. You hear the term neoconservative thrown around a lot. But let's call a spade a spade. These are incredibly powerful political forces that essentially operate as an extension of Tel Aviv's foreign policy, marching lockstep with Israeli interests. And this is the exact trap the Oval Office is caught in right now. The president is being crushed between two massive boulders. On one hand, sheer common sense and the survival of the global economy demand that we stop the bleeding and end this conflict immediately. On the other hand, you have the relentless, uncompromising pressure from Israel and its deeply entrenched lobbying arm right here at home. Pushing for more war, it's a dangerous tug of war. And American blood and treasure are caught right in the middle. Let's ask ourselves a hard question. Does Washington even know how to conduct real diplomacy anymore? It certainly doesn't look like it. Just look at the situation in Eastern Europe. We all remember the campaign promises. The president stood at the podium and swore he'd settle the Russia-Ukraine conflict overnight, maybe even before taking the oath of office. Yet here we are, watching a complete diplomatic breakdown. You look at the negotiating tactics, and you have to wonder if the current administration has any coherent grasp of statesmanship. And now we are seeing the exact same amateur hour play out with Iran. It's nearly impossible to decipher what the actual end game is. Take the recent ceasefire talks. For example, we were inches away from a breakthrough. We just needed two final pieces to fall into place, getting Israel and Hezbollah to stand down, and getting Tehran to unblock the waterways. By mid-April, the stars had seemingly aligned. A 10-day pause in the north was on the table, and the Iranians signaled they were ready to open up the strait. Waking up that morning, it looked like we finally had the recipe for peace. But what was the call from the Oval Office? The president flat out refused to lift the American blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. Naturally, Tehran pivoted right back to their hardline stance and slammed their end of the strait shut again. You sit back and watch this unfold, and you just have to ask, who is advising the commander-in-chief? He wanted a truce. He had it in his hands. But common sense dictates you can't expect the enemy to lay down their arms when you refuse to take your boot off their neck. So we are right back to square one. And who pays the price? The American driver. The cost of gas at the pump is only going to keep climbing. The bitter irony here is that we were previously looking the other way on Iranian oil exports, specifically to keep global energy costs manageable for our own citizens. By rigidly enforcing this blockade, we are essentially starving the market of that oil. It defies all strategic logic. If you are supposedly entering a week of serious peace talks, basic diplomacy dictates, you show a gesture of goodwill, like temporarily easing the pressure. Instead, we doubled down. It leaves seasoned analysts scratching their heads, searching for a master plan that probably doesn't exist. You even have voices across the political aisle pointing out the sheer absurdity of this hawkish playbook. Lawmakers are openly mocking the administration's escalate to de-escalate doctrine, and they have a valid point. We haven't escalated to peace, we've escalated to absolute devastation. We've reached a point where the Vatican is issuing warnings about war crimes, and the White House is openly floating the idea of wiping out foreign power grids. We have a vital global shipping lane entirely choked off, something we didn't face before this mess started. Gas prices have skyrocketed from the low $2 range to over $4 a gallon. Tehran has dug its heels in with an even more radical posture, and our regional allies in the Gulf are taking direct hits. We are alienating the world and getting lectured on the global stage. This grim reality is starting to hit hard, even among the president's most loyal media allies. You have prominent conservative commentators, men who wrote speeches and campaigned fiercely for this administration, now publicly broadcasting their profound regret. They are looking at the wreckage and admitting that they feel deeply implicated in this foreign policy disaster. They aren't just jumping ship, they are wrestling with their consciences, apologizing to their millions of viewers for inadvertently misleading them. It takes a certain kind of intellectual honesty to admit that on national television, the frustration stems from a deep sense of betrayal. During the campaign, the promise was a complete rejection of the old, neoconservative warmongering. He promised to break the mold. Even those of us who didn't cast a ballot for the man expected him to keep his word on keeping America out of these endless foreign entanglements. There was a tremendous amount of goodwill and hope when he first took office that we were finally turning the page on decades of failed Middle Eastern intervention. We believed the rhetoric. Sadly, the political lobby got their hooks in, and reality has proven otherwise. It's a tale as old as Washington itself. Sooner or later, powerful special interest lobbies get their hooks into every single commander-in-chief we elect, essentially forcing them to fall right into rank. Take a hard look at what recently unfolded behind closed doors during the Islamabad peace talks. Initially, the signals coming out of the White House strongly suggested the president was open to using Tehran's 10-point framework as a baseline for negotiations. But the moment boots hit the ground in Pakistan, that entire strategy was thrown out the window. The intel suggests that our lead negotiator, J.D. Vance, suddenly adopted a rigid, uncompromising posture at the table. The catalyst for this sudden pivot, the phone lines were reportedly burning up between Vance, the Oval Office, and Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's a glaring demonstration of the sheer gravitational pull this foreign lobby exerts over our highest elected officials. Even prominent conservative voices who fiercely champion this administration are waking up to the harsh reality. They are finally recognizing what many seasoned observers have known for years. This unwavering, unconditional allegiance has become a massive albatross hanging around America's neck. Heading into the summit, the administration had signaled a willingness to work with the 10-point Iranian proposal. Yet, when the delegates actually sat down, the American side abruptly yanked the rug out. They reverted to a 15-point U.S. manifesto packed with maximalist, non-starter demands. Naturally, the Iranian delegation wasn't about to swallow a list of 15 unilateral ultimatums while their own framework was completely ignored. The talks collapsed instantly. You really have to ask yourself, what was Washington's endgame here? It's easy to see why Tehran showed up. They wanted to project to the international community that they were the adults in the room, ready to make a deal. America's maneuver, however, defies all conventional diplomatic logic. That is, unless you accept the most obvious explanation, Tel Aviv stepped in, pulled the emergency brake, and explicitly strong-armed the administration into torpedoing the original agreement. It genuinely appeared that the president was ready to negotiate a pragmatic settlement. But then, the gears shifted violently under the crushing weight of Allied pressure. Even the Pakistani officials who hosted and mediated the summit confirmed this sequence of events. They noted that the original 10-point framework, which crucially included a comprehensive total ceasefire across Lebanon, was essentially agreed upon in principle before the talks even started. It's highly probable the president green-lit the concept without fully digesting the fine print, only to drastically backtrack the second his allies in Tel Aviv got him on the line to object. As we watch this global chess match continue to escalate, there is one undeniable takeaway you need to keep in mind. The lobby holds an absolute stranglehold over the Oval Office right now. The president's geopolitical steering wheel is effectively locked. He simply cannot maneuver without checking in with Jerusalem first to get his permission slip, because the moment he tries to chart an independent America First course, the political pressure brought down on his head is suffocating. And up to this point, he has been kept firmly on a very tight leash. Now, regarding this supposed second round of talks, let's clear the air. The American delegation hasn't even packed their bags in D.C. Why? Because Tehran is flat out refusing to pull up a chair. And frankly, looking at it objectively, why would they sit down with Washington right after our forces essentially hijacked and crippled one of their vessels? Not to mention, our side was fully planning to bring along the exact same minders from Tel Aviv who orchestrated the diplomatic sabotage we saw earlier this year. The only logical reason the Iranian delegation showed up to the first meeting was to project an image of good faith to the international community, perhaps hoping for some backdoor signal that America was finally ready to compromise. But make no mistake, as we often point out here on the federal front line, Tehran knows they are sitting comfortably in the driver's seat. As this conflict drags out and continues to bleed the global economy dry, Iran's leverage at the negotiating table only multiplies. If I were holding their hand of cards, I wouldn't have even bothered flying to Pakistan last week without an ironclad guarantee that the U.S. was ready to take their 10-point framework seriously. But the tension on the ground is palpable, and the paranoia runs deep. Consider the account of one of their delegates, an American-born professor out of Virginia who now teaches in Tehran. He was on that diplomatic flight back from Islamabad, and he revealed that the entire delegation genuinely believed they were going to be blown out of the sky on the trip home. The threat level was so severe that the pilot had to cut the radios and execute a blind, zero-notice diversion to an alternate airstrip. Who were they running from? It doesn't take a Pentagon analyst to connect those dots. It was either American or Israeli crosshairs, and most likely the latter, given Tel Aviv's long, well-documented track record of targeted decapitation strikes against leadership figures across the Middle East. The Iranian delegation's fear for their lives was entirely justified. If these two sides ever do agree to a second round, you can bet your bottom dollar it will be hosted in a fortress like Moscow or Beijing, far out of reach from Allied missiles. And what actually happened inside that negotiating room in Islamabad? It was a glaring display of compromised authority. According to the Iranian side, our lead negotiator couldn't even answer a basic yes or no question without hitting the pause button to dial Washington or, more likely, to get his marching orders from Tel Aviv. It was glaringly obvious that our delegation went in with a deliberately hardened posture. The immense weight of the pro-Israel lobby forced our negotiators to demand a completely unworkable, heavy-handed deal, which practically guaranteed the Iranians would walk away. So, where does this leave us? Trying to predict the next move in this political climate is a fool's errand. But if you look past the theatrical bluster and the tough talk coming out of the Oval Office, Washington has absolutely zero strategic interest in climbing further up the escalation ladder. We do not win a wider war here. In reality, a drawn-out, escalating conflict plays right into the Ayatollah's hands. Over the long haul, kicking this hornet's nest only solidifies Iran's ultimate advantage.